This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cincinnati area attorney Joey Ashbrook.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Joey, how you doing today?
Doing awesome, pal. Happy Saturday.
Yeah, happy Saturday to you, too. Yeah, we, as always, plenty has been going on this week. But before we get to that, I want to go back a little bit. You know, the last time, Joe, you and I did the show together, you said something that a number of listeners reacted to some pretty strongly. And so I'll quote you, is... You said, I think the single greatest impediment to unity in the country is the hubris of the left. Now, I responded to that by disagreeing and offering sort of my view that the single biggest impediment to unity is a president who, well, by his own admission, hates his opponents. It's the whole thing, after the Charlie Kirk murder, where I give Erica Kirk a lot of credit for saying she'd forgiven the man who killed her husband. And then, she said the answer to hate is not hate. A very Christian response. I liked it, but not President Trump's response. Anyway, the general view from listeners who heard this exchange and wrote in about it, and there were a number of them, was that the Trump administration and the MAGA movement are sort of the kings of hubris, with Trump regularly, saying things like he'd end Russia's war with Ukraine in 24 hours or build the greatest economy in the history of the world. I alone can fix it, that sort of thing. And one listener even said, does Joey know the meaning of the word hubris? Because when I think of excessive pride or self-confidence, I think of Donald Trump. So I wanted to throw that out there, Joey, because like I said, there were a lot of listeners who commented on it. I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Appreciate it. Appreciate the engagement from the audience, too. I'll tell you that if I'm used to my words having strong reactions generally, and especially growing up in a family of 4 kids. So not offended in the least. I'm definitely not a snowflake. So appreciate the engagement. Mike, I agree with Erica Kirk that I think the whole the paradigm of the question is small-minded, which is my fundamental point. Trump's probably the biggest personality in the last century across all forms and all walks of life, from politics to entertainment to sports. And he may even, with the rise of media, he may even be the biggest personality of all time. And on some level, when your mom doesn't like you, if you liked Willie Nelson growing up as a kid, and mom be like, hey, Willie's doing this, you'd laugh, you'd be like, that's Willie being Willie. On some level, Donald Trump is the biggest personality of our lifetimes, maybe in the last century. And a lot of the dynamics with him are his personality, and it's Donald Trump being Donald Trump. I've come to find it humorous, but I agree with his policies. I find him humorous, but I think the paradigm is small-minded because my point is ultimately about substance, and that's what matters the most. We get to decide who are we going to be as a country going forward, and always decide that. We're going to decide that in 5 years, in 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Are we going to be a country about the politics of ideas or the politics of identities? And he is a president. He is a leader and a president of big ideas. And in reality, his ideas are generally the best ideas of Democrats and Republicans over the last 50 years. That's Donald Trump. Dick Gephardt's handlers, 88, would have killed to have had Donald Trump be their candidate instead of Dick Gephardt. It's just his policies that he's adopted are really what are the right things for America. They're America first. The ideas are what were the best ideas, and we want America to succeed and thrive because decline is a choice. That's a fundamental tenet of the movement. And his viewpoint on the world is decline is a choice. we're unapologetically going to go the other direction. But a lot of those issues are issues that historically were things that Democrats championed, including, for example, tariffs. So if there's ever been a president, I think it's a missed opportunity for America. If there's ever been a president that has been a more willing partner for big ideas that's ever occupied the Oval Office, it's this guy. But we're so stuck in who wins, who loses, and at all costs, we've got to stop the other side when they win the election, that folks aren't getting beyond their own self-destructive pride to be able to see the bigger picture to build the country, to move it forward, because that's an opportunity. And there's still more than 3 years of Donald Trump's second term of his presidency left. And I'm not optimistic that it's not going to be squandered, but if it is, it's a huge missed opportunity. Even seeing Zohran Mamdani went into the Oval Office yesterday and met with the president, and he was magnanimous to the mayor-elect of New York, which is another point of mine. He is sneaky magnanimous. It's just because people want to see him through the lens people want to see him through, rather than who he is and just focusing our politics on ideas. Because if they do, our country can be even greater. I'm not naive enough to think that that's going to be the case, but our country can be even greater. So I think the idea about Trump statements versus this guy's statements versus that guy's statements, I think is a small-minded paradigm. And my larger point is that even beyond all that, there are big fish out there. He's going after big fish, and they're big fish, some of which historically Democrats have been right about. He's just moving the country forward on them. And I think it's more of a statement of the animalistic leftist influences in the Democratic Party than it is the true unifying potential of Donald Trump. I think if the other side let him be, he would be the most magnanimous, unifying president maybe that we'd ever had.
Wow.
Because his personality is so big.
Okay. I will certainly agree that Donald Trump is a fan of taking big swings. Where I'll disagree is I think some of those swings are horrifically misguided swings. I do agree that he can be magnanimous, but I would argue that Trump's magnanimosity, that can't be the word, magnanimousness, I don't know, let's go with that, is based on subservience. And so certainly I agree he could take the country very far in the direction he wants to take it in, as long as everyone who disagrees with him would just shut the hell up. But anyway, other segment, we could do a whole thing on that.
This is important, Mike, but this is important because we talk about, look, if we're going to, this is a show it's based around having people with different viewpoints being able to talk.
Yep.
And I am conservative. It's important. And you and I don't necessarily agree on everything. I think it's good. I think it's healthy. I think it's important. But I think that's the subservience point. I think that it's not, I think my friends who are even well-meaning and who disagree, the emotional view of subservience, I think, is just their desire to not accept where they lose, repackaged as he's trying to submit me. There's never been a president. He's never, like, to the extent that people didn't like the religious infusion aspects of the Reagan Revolution, like, you're just trying to tell me, you're trying to say I've got to live the way Pat Robertson gives me a checklist, and Jim and Tammy Baker. Sure. And I understand the impulse to not want to be under that thumb, but Donald Trump also understands the impulse to not be under that thumb. He himself is a product of not cowtailing to the lesser angels of the self-righteous control. And I think that a lot of the hatred toward Donald Trump is that exact same impulse coming at it from the other direction. It's self-righteousness in different ways. And I think my encouragement, not accusing you of self, I'm just asking people to be curious and examine themselves, because I'm not perfect. The single greatest impediment to me achieving my greatest potential as a human being is me. It's not anybody else. But I think that's part of being human. And my take on the dynamics with Trump is that if folks treated Trump the way that they would want to be treated, not as a religious statement, but just as throwing the golden rule in people's face, but just as a statement of reality, I think that what they'd actually find is, and I kind of like this guy, he's funny, and we could do something really big that I like, that's good for me too, because there's never been a person in the Oval Office who's as open to doing big things as this guy.
Okay. Well, and like you said, I think it's important to surface these sort of fundamental differences in viewpoints. I mean, you see him as a funny, likable guy. If you give him his chance, I see him as a dangerous, toxic narcissist, possibly sociopath. And so that's a pretty big difference there. But we can both agree that Donald Trump takes an awful lot of big swings when it comes to policies. Anyway. All right. Well, if folks have questions on that or anything else, please, do send them in. We're happy to continue this discussion further if you'd like. But for now, we'll put a pin in that and kind of move forward on, well, one of the big stories this week is that this week, of course, Congress overwhelmingly voted to release the Epstein files. It passed the Senate through unanimous consent. And in the House, there was that single no vote from Clay Higgins, Republican of Louisiana. And the legislation, which was signed into law by President Trump, it really marks, in a lot of folks' eyes, including mine, a major reversal for Trump, who'd been calling the files a Democrat hoax made up by Comey, Obama, and Biden, in his words. But, once there were 218 votes in the House to force a vote on the measure through a discharge petition, all of a sudden, Trump and Speaker Mike Johnson bowed to the inevitable and got on board with the release. It's really the second reversal on this issue for Trump, who was for releasing the files before he was against it, promising during his campaign to make the Epstein files public. And the vote to release Department of Justice files on Epstein, this follows the House Oversight Committee's release of around 20,000 pages of Epstein-related documents, as well as President Trump's directive to the Department of Justice to investigate some high-profile Democrats with alleged ties to Epstein, including former President Bill Clinton, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, and top Democratic donor Reid Hoffman. And, Attorney General Pam Bondi, being in the relationship with Donald Trump that she is, a subservient underling, she got right on it. She assigned U.S. Attorney Jay Clayton to head up that investigation. It's, of course, totally not political. It's just a wild coincidence that the only people Trump wanted to run through the ringer here happened to be Democrats. But anyway, under the law, the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Within 30 days, the Department of Justice has to publish all unclassified Epstein records, documents, communications, investigative materials, and it has to do so in a searchable and downloadable format, though it can withhold personal information that concerns victims or any information that could jeopardize an active federal investigation. The legislation also stipulates that President Trump may, through an executive order, classify other Epstein file materials in the interest of national defense or foreign policy. So, Joey, I'm wondering what your take is on this. In particular, what, if anything, it tells us about potential fault lines in the MAGA coalition, which I guess at this point is essentially the Republican Congressional Coalition.
Well, I actually might not be surprising, but I don't think that this story, the most interesting part is fault lines in the MAGA coalition. I think it's fault lines on the left among the Dems. I personally think transparency is important in government. And at the same time, so that on some level, I don't have any problem with the impulses of wanting the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to be displayed generally. But I think this issue is on some level the height of the stupidity of our politics. The amount of oxygen it's going to get, this isn't going to be over. It's going to be, and it is going to be extremely unwieldy, and it's going to be the political cudgel that is used for the next several years in America. And I think it's most interesting on the left. So my brother, who's a commentator and a political pro, always says, and it's very true, if you see a story that can be negative to a Democrat, the only reason is because it hurts another Democrat. And I think that things that we found out almost immediately from the release of this information, one is, well, among other things, Hakeem Jeffries was raising money from Daniel Epstein. His people were. His fundraisers were raising money from Epstein in 2013, well after everything had hit the fan with Epstein. And Representative Laskett was in 2019 in a Trump hearing talking to Michael Cohen, was texting with Epstein to get dirt on Trump, to try to make a play on Trump in that hearing itself. So the Dems are actively sourcing and using Epstein for their own individual gain or political gain, or to get Trump. And all that stuff's going to be in the files. So I think back to a point we talked about from the jump about the dynamic about personality hubris. I think this also fits into the category of, I'm not saying that to say this is about the Dems, not the GOP. I'm saying that to say I think there's aspects of this that are extremely small-minded and are stupid. It's just stupid, salacious politics. There's aspects of this that are stupid, salacious politics that endanger criminal investigations by just releasing information related to informants, and there'll be some breaks on that, and people will be responsible with it. But I think aspects of it, transparency is good, but aspects of this are small-minded. That's going to boomerang on a lot of people, including Dems. But the interesting part is, Mr. Baranowski, that the people who, for the Dem side, that it would boomerang on the most are the people who were around and whose hands are sullied by the reality of Democratic politics in that era that was cozy with Epstein, not antagonistic to Epstein. So who does that benefit, Mike? It benefits the younger new guard who wants to be in charge. So I think that in the current and ongoing and future Democrat civil war, I think that is an interesting thing to pay attention to. I think, unfortunately, it favors more of the leftist impulses of the Democratic Party that I am rooting hard against, because I think a healthy Democratic Party is healthy for America, even if I don't agree with them. But I think that this thing is unwieldy. It's going to continue to be unwieldy, and I think it's going to be attempted to be used as a new Russia dynamic with President Trump. And I'm not sure it's going to end up against him the way his opponents wish it would be, because I am still a big believer that if the Biden administration, who had all this stuff, really had anything specifically damning on President Trump, it absolutely would have been used in the prosecutorial gate that they embarked on for 4 years. Well, he was not the president.
I agree. I agree with that part for sure. I think, there was an investigation, though. I think part of this plays into a generally held belief by a lot of folks that if you are rich and connected, the rules don't really apply to you, and you can more or less buy your way out of just about anything. And maybe that's because we've all seen far too many TV shows with just horrible, awful billionaire type folks, or maybe it's because, well, most billionaires are horrible, sociopathic folks. I don't. Maybe the truth's somewhere in between. Those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. But I think, to me, really, it seems like most of the momentum for this has come from the conspiratorial right. I mean, they were the ones who really pushed for this more than anyone else. I think it's an interesting angle you point out, that could this potentially benefit some younger progressive Democrats by possibly kneecapping some elder statespeople in the party? I don't really think so, because most of those people, Mike, I think are named are not really active in Democratic politics in a big way. And you can find stuff. I mean, there are tens of thousands of pages and things will come out and so forth. But it seems to me that the facts on the ground are that Donald Trump said this was a hoax, pushed against it, and they tried to do everything they could to not get this stuff released. Fought against that, but all of a sudden they realized the tide had turned and they jumped on that bandwagon. And that's just that. Those are facts on the ground. No one can wish away.
Well, but he also signed the bill into law, and I think the reason it's very possible, Mike, that the reason he was that he thought it. It's very possible he thought it was a mistake to release it because of the more chivalrous aspects and impulses of his nature, which he doesn't get any credit for, which is a point we talked about this last time I made. And I think that very well still might be the case here. So, like, for example, the libs released an email, or the Dems released an email that had him on it, that had a redacted name on it, to suggest that he was specifically involved with a young lady related to the Epstein orbit. The specific lady who they redacted out of that email was Virginia Giuffre, who tragically committed suicide recently, but in her memoirs specifically exonerates Trump in calling him a gentleman. But it was redacted to give the appearance as if Trump was involved in it in a way he wasn't, which is just, it's cold-blooded, deceptive politics that's ends justifying rather than the means, truth be damned. And back to my point about small-minded, I'm probably too desensitized to expect politics to do every bit of smarmy, dishonest, whatever, just to win. But there's another part of me at the same time that thinks that's stupid and small-minded and gets tired part of it because thinks, hey, America really is worth fighting for. A better future really is worth fighting for. And are we really consuming all of our oxygen with this stupid stuff? This is what we're going to talk about. And when you have all those pages, this is Control F is a powerful thing, my friend. And AI with Control F and all of our friends that are going to be sitting in front of their computers and finding
Amen.
things
Yep.
with their Substack and their podcasts.
Yep.
I think this baby's got legs, and I think it's going to be unwieldy. And I think when the president says things like, be careful what you wish for, he knows that. It's
Sure.
going to be, I don't know how this is going to fall out. It helps the young, misnamed progressives. And I just mean in the actual definition of the word progressive, if we're going to definitions, the younger members of the Democratic Party who are ambitious, I think it's 100% helps them. And I think it's going to be a positive fallout for them.
Yeah. So I certainly agree with you on on this issue being blown out of proportion in a sense in that I don't think there's a whole lot of there except a lot of opposition research, kind of all kinds of nuggets and that sort of thing. But it's so salacious, right? I mean, this is a bad guy by almost anyone's definition of the terms. And so it's really hard to stand up for Jeffrey Epstein or any of the horrific stuff that he did. But the opportunity costs here, all the time focusing on this, you're right. There are substantive things that, because all of this, I mean, most of this happened quite a while ago, right? I mean, the FBI investigation into Epstein started nearly 2 decades ago, right? With that sex trafficking conviction coming in 2019 and so forth. So I agree with you about that part. But there is one other thing I wanted to ask you about. If I heard you correctly, did you characterize Donald Trump as chivalrous?
Yeah, I actually think I do. I think he has. But Mike, this is what I'm encouraging you to see. And I'm glad we started with what we did on the jump. I had similar impulses in that I didn't like Donald Trump's personality at first. And we talked the first time I was on the show, I gave a little bit of my background. In that first election in 2016, I voted for him largely because of substance. And I'm a big believer that you have primaries for a reason. Someone wins the primary, and if you're a member of the party, you support the nominee of your party. I believe in that as a principle. But I had a conversation with my mom a couple days before the election, wrestling with it. And my mom is the most godly woman that I know. She's also very practical. And she said, Joey, he's just like my dad. His personality is just like my dad, and in all of his bombast, but at his core and his heart, he's got a lot of good stuff about him. That was my mom's take, and in retrospect, I agree with my mom. I'm glad that I listened to her, as I often say that in my life, and in that day in 2016. And in retrospect, what my mom said is vindicated and proven to be true. And this point I'm about to make is really important because it piggybacks off something else he said that I 100% agree with. The impulse that billionaires get away with everything or different rules apply, I think is a real problem. And everything should apply the same. It's just because you have money or just because you're in power shouldn't mean that you get to do things that are not right. 110%. The flip side of that that's also true is just because you have money doesn't mean you deserve to go to jail.
Sure.
We really need to treat people. Everybody matters, whether you have no money or a ton of money. You matter the same. Your worth is the same, I believe, because you're a human being made in the image of God. And that comes from my religious convictions, but I also believe it's true. I think Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence embodies that principle. It's self-evident that all men are created equal. All of us are created equal. Trump's chivalry, he knows more than anybody else what it's like to have his name dragged through the mud from lies. Russiagate, we talked about, was worse than Watergate. And he had himself driven through the mud as if he's a traitor to the country when the whole thing was a plant by his political opponents, run by the people in power who were entrusted by the American people to be in power to take care of the country rather than just political interest. He knows. He also is a guy who grew up and made his name in the tabloid world. So in the world of, are you just the salacious versus the substantive core in a world of paparazzi and glitz and glamour? He knows what it's like to be a real person because we're all real people with the challenges that come from that. And I think that his chivalrous impulse is to say, he knows, look, Epstein was a Democrat fundraiser. There's just no way that, I get back to my point about this, is going to help the people who are young, who are not around for the entirety of the whole saga. He was a Democratic fundraiser. Trump knows it's going to implicate a ton of people that are Democrats, but it's also going to implicate people. Maybe there's a whistleblower who is a good person who's going to come out that they were a whistleblower. Maybe there's someone who wasn't really involved, but because Epstein is so interconnected in the socialite life in New York, these are people he knows and his friends that he knows may have a good core, but are not on the same board with Epstein's stuff. But Epstein was such a smarmy navigator of the political dynamic. It's all intertwined. So I think he actually does have chivalrous impulses of, my friends, I don't want people being falsely accused of stuff and to be dragged through the mud, whether they're my friends or not, because that's not right. And he understands that. If you're someone, and this is why I don't understand why people don't jump on more with him, Mike, if you have libertarian impulses as a Democrat and you don't like the idea, I disagree with the narrative of white Christian nationalism, but if you don't like the idea of a Christian nationalist state that's going to come into your house and tell you what to do and say that you've got to do this checklist of all these self-righteous acts for these 10 things today, and you better do life the way I want you to. There has never been a better Republican president than Donald J. Trump for that stuff. His entire ethos is contra to that way of being, and not to be controlled by that kind of stuff while keeping his eye on the big picture. Because a lot of the things coming out of the Reagan Revolution were deeply correct for America, for the country. So for people who would be afraid of, hey, I'm going to be falsely accused, there ain't no better guy than Donald Trump to understand what that's like and not want you to be falsely accused. And I think a lot of the Epstein dynamic comes out of those impulses, which makes him exactly the kind of guy you'd want in power.
Gotcha. Now, I would see things very differently. I would say that his instinct isn't chivalry. His instinct is, if he can't protect somebody who has been loyal to him at no cost whatsoever to himself, he'll do that. But I think he'll throw someone under the bus in just a half a second. And so that's not really a chivalrous impulse. And again, I would say that your argument that he's excellent for people who believe in liberty and freedom and all, that's true as long as you are a white, straight, male. But if you are, say, trans, or if you are undocumented, or if you are in a number of various classes, even if you just routinely disagree with him, he has no compunction in making up stories, lying like hell, doing the sort of things that people, in fact, did to him. And let me just say, more generally, to make this less about Donald Trump, a bigger picture, if Congress and President Trump actually cared about transparency and legitimacy involving the Epstein files or these other cases, they'd make structural changes. They would do things like strengthen whistleblower protections, or they'd further empower inspectors general, or even maybe simply not have the president blatantly direct the attorney general to investigate his political enemies. And yeah, I know Republicans will say that this started under Clinton and then Obama, and there's something to that. I absolutely agree. But as with almost everything else, Trump took it and turned it up to 12, arguing that somehow that, well, if you are blatantly corrupt and working the system, that's somehow more honorable because it's more open. At least I'm not lying about this sort of thing. And again, but as you pointed out, we're coming at this from such very different perspectives that it's almost hard, I think, for fit into that other worldview. Because when you talk about Trump as being chivalrous, the first thing I think of is Access Hollywood. If you're a star, grab him by the you know what. And I think, my God, that's not chivalrous. That's an insane person. That's a deeply mentally disturbed person talking. But anyway.
Well, because Mike, we are all better than our worst day. We're all better than the dumbest things we say. We all do really dumb stuff. And if we had a recording with us for everything that we did in life, now the internet is kind of that. Everything you do is recorded. Oh, yeah. This is going to be an example of that. But we'd all be embarrassed as all get out with things in our life. And I think, though, that human beings, the reality is we're all messed up, fallen, and broken. And that there's both the better and lesser angels of our nature. And the man also has better angels of his nature that are deeply honorable and attractive. And I think his authenticity taps into that in a way. But I agree with you. It's not ultimately about the president anyway. I think that the main story here is, from the cynical political aspect, is this is going to have life. This is going to help the younger up and comers in the Democratic Party. And I think that a lot of it, while transparency is important, and it really is, I think the politics of this is going to be salaciously annoying and enduring. If we want ideas, my encouragement to everybody is, if we focus on ideas rather than just our view of somebody or the image we need to make somebody or the straw man we need to make our opponents. And we focus on ideas. That's where the common ground is, because the one you raised about whistleblower protections, if we have a well thought out whistleblower and accountability regime change for structural change for the long-term health of the United States federal government, there are going to be some huge allies in the current administration for that kind of thing. He came to power largely on the drain the swamp impulses. So I don't think there would be enemies there at all. And I think there's a lot of room to craft really good structural solutions. I'm 100% on board for that.
I agree with you about that more general point. I would love to believe that the Trump administration would be open to that sort of thing. I don't think that's the case. I don't think we'll see it happen. But anyway, we shall see. But I do agree with you that this is certainly going to be a gold mine for opposition research folks as we are gearing up for the midterms. And of course, every hour that we spend on the Epstein files or Congress spends on the Epstein files is an hour they don't spend on meaningful legislative work, like, putting together a federal budget. And of course, this has already been just about the least productive Congress in a long time. Now, part of that, of course, is due to such a small margin in the House, but a lot of it is the things you point out is that we've gotten so embroiled in the personalities and the politics that we forget what this is all about. And it's, of course, all about trying to craft policies that help the American people and make this a better place for everyone to live in. And it's so easy for that to get lost in this kind of stuff that's going on.
Yeah, 110%. Here. I agree with that.
Well, why don't we move on to something a little bit different now, Joey?
Yeah, so from the gold mine of opposition research and the Democrats' civil war to a peg in the ladder of America's ascendancy back to the golden age of America, the president's meeting with the crown prince and prime minister of Saudi Arabia this week in the White House, MBS, where MBS committed to, originally Saudi Arabia had committed to $600 billion of investment in the United States. And he commented and committed in the Oval Office and said it's actually going to be closer to $1 trillion. In addition to that, they announced that they were going to be purchasing F-5s and additional tanks from the United States, and discussed the possibility of Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords, which MBS mentioned was going to be linked to a two-state solution, but they continue to move in that direction, which itself would be a tectonic shift in Middle East policy for a better future, and rather than being stuck in the fights of the past, building a better future. So the meeting with the president with MBS is consistent with his better accomplishments, of which are legion, during the first 10 months of the administration, including trillions and trillions of dollars in foreign investment and structurally resetting foreign policy in one of the most troubling spots in the world to allow a better future, both for Americans and for those all over the world. Mike, do you see this meeting as another example of Trump's outside the box structural thinking to reverse American decline and set America up for our greatest century? Or do you see this meeting as an example of Trump's deficiencies in the eyes of folks who see the world your way?
I see the question as a false choice.
Well, give me the middle way. I want to hear it.
Well, I guess I see in both ways. For one thing, sure. I believe in realist foreign policy. And the United States has a long history of doing business with disreputable regimes for the greater good. I accept that. I don't like it, but I understand that sometimes it has to be the case. I'll admit to being deeply troubled by when our own CIA says that MBS knew about, and in fact was behind, the plan to kill a Washington Post reporter. I was talking about Khashoggi here. And then Trump, in response to that, says, things happen, and don't embarrass our guest by asking about that. That really bothers me in a fundamental way. We could just throw that overboard that quickly, that blithely, that Donald Trump could at least. But having said that, I also see the strategy here. And all in all, I think I tend to agree with it. And here's why. To me, the biggest thing here is the AI focus. Because of course we're in this big AI battle with China, and Saudi Arabia is huge here because we're planning on an awful lot of data center building out the data centers for that compute that we need, and it is so much easier to do that in Saudi Arabia for a couple of reasons. Number one, because of course they have all that cheap energy right there, easy to tap. But number two, because Saudi Arabia is an authoritarian regime, it is so much easier and quicker to build things there, like data centers, like the energy infrastructure needed for that. I mean, when you take a look at like in the US, just the permitting to build this sort of thing can take years and years. It's so much quicker in China. It's not quite as quick in Saudi Arabia, but if this is a real existential battle, I get why Saudi Arabia can be such an important component of that. And so I think on balance, I approve of the sort of all in on Saudi Arabia sort of thing, though it kind of turns my stomach in a way that we have to deal with these authoritarian, deeply repressive regimes. But when I think about the alternative, I'm like, God, this sucks, but it probably sucks a little bit less or a lot less than losing the AI battle to China. So I'm stuck with the lesser of two evils here, I think.
Which is honestly often the decisions that when you got to make decisions, it's often the decision you got to make is what is the lesser of two evils of the decisions. So do you think that, talk about the foreign investment that Trump has been securing, your view on that? Do you think that's positive? Do you think, is that a begrudging thing that people can't acknowledge or it's overplayed? In a way, if you think about governors in a state, the best governors are governors who can be not only cheerleaders, but recruit for their states in the competitive American landscape for jobs, for investment, for economics, so their people have a better life. Donald Trump is the first president who effectively, openly, and aggressively, almost in the same way that good governors have developed in America in the last 30 years of doing, for America to thrive, to fight for and secure investment that is going to benefit Americans. And all the dollars are not flowing in immediately, but they're going to. And I think so that's an observation that's an interesting dynamic that he, for America, is like a governor for a state, but for the country is the number one recruiter of investment to the country. And I think what's interesting from that is that we talk about tariffs, that tariffs are back to decline as a choice in America first. Tariffs are a way of trying to stop the hollowing out of American industry and give us a chance to bring our industry back for national security and long-term viability reasons. Getting investment that has essentially been offshored from the hollowing out and now bringing investment back on is the capitalization of that effort from sources who have benefited from the lesser angels of that 40 or 50 year run. So I think those things structurally for the next American century, if we keep on them and we don't abandon them, are really foxy smart. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for it. But what do you think?
Oh, I think they're incredibly dumb, and he deserves all the credit for them. Absolutely. So we agree that he deserves the credit here. But I think protectionism is sticking your head in the sand sort of answer. Now, I've long been an advocate for strategic protectionism in the sense of like national security and that sort of thing. But in the way he's doing it, no. Now, specifically when it comes to Saudi Arabia, if Saudi Arabia wants to invest $1 trillion in the U.S., other things being equal, I am for that. Although, of course, MBS was very careful to not mention the time frame for that because, by the way, Saudi Arabia's entire GDP is barely over $1 trillion. So this is a longer term sort of thing. And so the top line numbers, I'm saying, just ignore the top line numbers. But again, I think, though, if we expect by drawing Saudi Arabia closer, which is clearly the plan here, that they're somehow going to liberalize, well, we learned that lesson with China. And I think the danger here is giving Saudi Arabia more leverage. And because that's essentially what we're doing. And so this is the kind of the tension we're dealing with by saying, okay, you're going to be our partner in this AI business, and you're going to be our bulwark in the Middle East along with Israel here in this kind of weird way, right? Ends up giving them more leverage. And that could be a problem a little bit down the line. I'm not saying it will be. Foreign policy is about making the least bad choice a lot of times. Again, in general, I think I like the approach Clearly, what we have been doing in the Middle East for generations has not been effective. And so I see the logic of going all in on Saudi Arabia, even though from a human rights perspective, it turns my stomach. I understand the strategy, and I actually think it's a good one. I'm willing to give Donald Trump, I can say Donald Trump is, I think, a horrible human being, but that doesn't mean he's always wrong. And I think in this case, his instinct on this is, I feel like it might not be such a bad one.
But I don't see him as I agree with you. Thank you, by the way. I don't think he's a protectionist. I think he's a realist. And it's the same way of saying we never have had free trade. I'm a free trader, but we've never had free trade. So fair trade in a world where you don't have free trade, in an imperfect world, it's kind of like lesser two evils, is an absolute necessity to protect and help Americans thrive and flourish. And this guy, so we had decades. I think one of the challenges in the current political environment, and is that from affordability and pricing that the American people need to be able to thrive in their day-to-day life, there's things are not instantaneous. And Treasury Secretary Bessent talks about his expectations in terms of quarters ahead, and I think that's probably right. So things are not instantaneous and they take time. I think that we've got all the structural pieces for a next boom. But if that happens, what I want people to recognize and realize is the reason we're going to have it is because this movement, largely generated by the force of personality of this guy, who's also the same force of personality that has us potentially on the doorstep of a Mideast peace that is not one-sided to Israel or the other folks who live in the region, and that no one's been able to break through. His impulses and what he's done has changed structurally the ability to do that, from the tariffs and securing investment to reverse, not just say, let's stop declining, but how do we reverse that? There's nothing more American than looking at the world and saying, this is the way the world is. And then you kind of smile with a glint in your eye and say, but that's not the way the world has to be. And you go make something up and figure it out and solve the problem and change it. This is an example of him actively doing that, and securing these investments in the United States is not only stopping a decline and a hollowing out, it's fighting for the structural fixes that are necessary to mechanically change the direction of the country with respect to those. And so if America 100 years from now is still around, is still a thriving democracy where people have podcasts that laugh and make fun of each other and disagree vehemently about stuff, and we're thriving and we are stronger 100 years from now than where we were 50 years ago, he will deserve historically a ton of credit. And that's why he really is so significant in the course of American history, and why people like me, substantively, even if we understand the aspects, the small-minded question about hubris, it's because what he's doing is so important, and I think he's pulling it off. He's on track to have one of the most consequential, important structural presidencies for a non-World War II president that's not named Abraham Lincoln or was the founding father of the United States, George Washington, in American history. Because in his moment in time, he's changing those structural impediments that have led us on decline, because decline is a choice and we can change it. And that's what he's been doing.
And another name for some of those structural impediments, the Constitution of the United States of America. I like that structural impediment to presidential power. And so I guess my point here, I mean, I'm joking, not really, but even if I agreed with you on the policy, even if I agreed with you on the premise of we are in major decline and Donald Trump is in a unique position to reverse, I reject the decline premise. But even if I accepted all of that, I would say that it's not worth overturning the structural guardrails to a sort of a soft to maybe not so soft authoritarianism. I mean, I understand the frustration of not being able to get stuff done. I understand the impulse to find ways around the Constitution and federal laws and Congress and the courts and all these pesky little things that sometimes, yes, can get in the way of doing things that we legitimately believe are good things. But as a country, we believe that democracy, even though it is incredibly inconvenient and laborious, that's the best way to do things. And anyone, whether he has all of my policy views, we're in lockstep, or we're 180 degrees different on these views, I cannot accept anyone, whether it's Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and I called them out when they did this, anyone who is breaking these democratic norms and structures to try to get stuff done, I think that is horrifically misguided. And I believe you're right that Donald Trump will be seen, 50, 100 years from now as having one of the most significant presidencies. But my concern is that we'll point it to as this was our decline into a period of presidential authoritarianism. And I see a dark future because of that, because both sides seem to be going full tilt into that sort of thing, whether it's, doing it or responding to it. And I think it's going to get a lot worse before or even if it gets better. And I place a lot of blame for that. It goes both ways, but I place a lot of blame for that on Donald Trump.
Well, I share a desire for a country that is more bottom up than top down, 110%. And I think that that's the winning future of our country is bottom up through our democratic principles and our principles of freedom. So anything I can do as a friend to help with that, I will always be an ally in that. And I think, though, on the hubris point from the initial question that led off the show, democracy in 2016, Donald Trump shocked the world in an event that was, there's nothing more American than a guy that nobody gave credit to and everybody made fun of, shocking the world and winning the White House. And there was massive resistance to the democratic will of the American people within our system. And a lot of the problems that's related to not being able to work with him come from the refusal to admit his success in his campaigns and what he did that tapped into something in the American people. And that's the hubris point I'm talking about. Reason he won was itself because of the hubris that carried into, for example, mask mandates with kids in schools where the experts all knew better. But then we messed up kids for a long time. And then on the back end, everybody wants to say, well, we didn't really know. Well, we should have been saying we don't really know on the front end and had less of an authoritarian take with how we do everything and run the railroad and make everybody mask up. So I agree with the impulse to have a bottom up America, not a top down or authoritarian. And we need to be people who keep talking honestly and open so that those who could take advantage of Americans' hatred of each other and can benefit from it, that they don't have the oxygen to be able to do that. And that's why I think that's why talking is so doggone important.
Yeah.
It's easy to just get people spun up forever in a never-ending death spiral of hatred. And one of my points is we need to stop that.
Amen.
And we need to move forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's move. Okay, why don't we move on?
Yeah. Because you're talking about respecting the rule of law and constitutional constraints. So our next topic is actually Gavin Newsom and California's blatant violation of said principle with this ban on masked agents that they recently enacted that extends to federal agents. And if you have not read about this, you can Google the California masked agent ban, and you can pull up some news articles about it, and you can even see the text of the statute. But it basically prohibits not only state and local law enforcement, but also federal law enforcement in the act of enforcing the law from wearing masks. Now, they do have some exceptions. Those exceptions are specifically tailored to meet the needs of local law enforcement, such as SWAT teams, and they are directly intended to prevent ICE officers from wearing masks in the discharge of their duties. And not only does it come with criminal penalties, it also comes with civil penalties to give people who may be detained by ICE agents wearing masks a private right of action for civil remedy to sue those people over related to the use of in the detention, which comes with statutory fines and actual damages, whichever is greater, the greater of $10,000 or the actual damages, which is, of course, intended to try to chill on the part of the law enforcement officer's use of the mask. So, Mike, there's two issues here. One is legal, one is policy. You can think that wearing masks is a good idea. It's necessary in the current climate. I'm sure we'll have some vigorous disagreement about that. And let's just talk about the ICE agents, because that's really what this bill's about. Mm-hmm. I think it's a publicity stunt, but it's a publicity stunt and a power move, but I have strong federalism impulses. So, okay, I'm willing to entertain the discussion. You have the policy about the wearing the masks, and you have the legal question of whether the state can tell the federal government's federal officers how they have to conduct their affairs. And I've got my thoughts on that, but what say you on policy first and then the legal piece, if you have any
Yeah.
a strong take on either?
I guess I'll start with the legal part of it. I tend to agree with the government's argument that this is, in effect, a violation of the Supremacy Clause, in that I thought about this a lot, and sort of the common counter that one's heard, at least that I've heard this week, is, well, it's a generally applicable state law, just like something like, say, a speed limit. And so therefore, that's perfectly okay to do because it's not specifically targeting the federal government. But when I really started to dig into that, this is different because something like obeying a speed limit, that doesn't directly affect the ability of federal agents to safely do their job in the way that anti-mask and ID requirement laws do. And so I don't think the analogy is apt. And there's a long history of case law back from Henry Nagel in 1890 that says that federal officers that are acting within their official duties can't be prosecuted under state law. So constitutionally, I think this is probably a losing issue. Now, but on the policy side of things, well, I'm kind of torn, actually, because I am concerned about federal agents not being doxxed and not being, and this is an issue, right? I mean, CPB has reported, DHS has reported a 58% in attacks against vehicular attacks since last year at this time. They say there's been a major increase in doxing of ICE agents. Now, they say it's 8,000%. The problem is they don't give us any of the bottom line data for what that's based off of, which is very kind of sketchy. For instance, if, say, there were 5 doxing attacks last in 2024, and 8,000% would be 405 out of like 30,000 ICE agents. I hate when they provide that data without that kind of backing stuff. But anyway, other issues. So my larger point, though, is that, yeah, there is a real tension here. But on the other side, there have also been multiple documented cases of people impersonating ICE agents to intimidate folks, to harass folks, in some cases, even to kidnap people. And so, to me, even more than that, living in a democracy, I believe that as a general rule, law enforcement should have to identify itself. This whole idea of just kind of generally going around with masks and no ID, that hits that authoritarian sort of vibe is really strong there. And I admit there are instances in which that is absolutely necessary, but those instances should be a bare minimum. So I think there's a real tension here, and it's really difficult for me.
But from the opposite end of the telescope, I agree with you. It's pretty clear to me that it's not constitutional. I think even in the era of American jurisprudence where federalism and the 10th Amendment were not robustly, to make an argument, they're still not completely robustly employed, putting a pin in, if the conservative revolution on the court continues for another couple decades, you wonder if there will be some further invigoration of the 10th Amendment. But setting that aside, even in the old days, where the 10th Amendment wasn't very robust, the one thing you could not do if you're the federal government, it's called the anti-commandeering principle. You can't tell state officers, you can't co-opt the state's officers into doing what you want from a policy standpoint. That's inherent in being a sovereign. The states are separate sovereigns from the federal government, but the federal government, the United States government, is also a sovereign. So this is basically, yeah, you could get into technicalities of the law in the Supremacy Clause, but from a fundamental standpoint, this is basically commandeering the policy of what the federal government can do with its own agents. So as a legal, I don't think it'll stand, and it's not a good idea to be able to have one state or even 10 states tell the federal government, this is how your agents have to behave or perform, or what they can or can't do. And the fact that there's civil penalties that come with it are intentionally designed to chill people, the officers they're intentionally designed to force the officers to incur more risk in enforcing the law or doing what they're doing, and make choices where they know that if they're not going to wear a mask, they think it's going to make them less likely to want to do what they're vigorously do their job. On the policy, from a policy standpoint, my came to America. My mom's a first generation American. No, second generation. My grandfather came to America when he was 11. She's first generation born American. Her family came to America because of the Nazis, specifically because of political freedom in the 1930s in Germany. And I grew up as a kid hearing those stories in that from my great grandmother and my family about our family identity being bound up in freedom and the idea of authoritarian regimes oppressing that freedom because they hate other people, and the damage that that does in the freedom of America and how great America is to give us a place of freedom where we can disagree, but you've got the space and the right to live whether you agree or not. So I don't like the idea of I agree with you. Law enforcement should generally not wear masks, except in the extent where there's specific instances where it's necessary. If you think about a SWAT team, or you think about wearing gas masks, which are examples in the statute itself, or you're an undercover officer. The problem with this comes back to the overall policy point. It's that the people who think like me think it's necessary in the reality of the situation of enforcing our immigration laws and solving the big problem that my friends politically who disagreed with created related to the mass illegal immigration entrance in the United States and our remedying of that. And it's so the violent risks that overtones that are being threatened and effectuated with the doxing on these agents that we're in such an unfortunate place for the health of our country, and that I do think it's necessary. So from a policy standpoint, I strongly prefer for agents to never be masked. Like if you had the idea of in a Joe Biden administration, they're going to say that so the Biden administration had a policy document about bathrooms related to school bathrooms. They didn't actually change the regulation when you get into like the gender identity issues, and basically saying that it violates Title IX if you don't allow transgender individuals to use the bathrooms of their choice. But if you had an idea, and that was just they didn't want to change the law, and they're trying to use federal power to make people change what they're going to do and scare people at local school boards into doing what the libs wanted them to do. But if the Biden administration is sending federal agents to people's houses in my neighborhoods related to people on school boards who are speaking up at school boards saying we shouldn't do this isn't the law, you better believe hell to high water, we would be extreme. I would not like that at all. That would really bother me. It's just in this particular instance, you can see in the wake of the Charlie Kirk shooting, without doing a segment on Charlie Kirk and the violence, I think that it's people's reaction to that even if you've got a quarter of the country whose reaction was they think that the shooting is I would consider was a callous reaction, or people in protest threatening with the gun sign of being shot in the neck. I think that's not me saying that to win a cheap argument. That's small-minded politics, which I rejected from the outset of the discussion. That's me bringing it up to say, I think that's the health of our country right now, which is extremely unhealthy. And I don't think there's another way for these guys to expect them to vigorously enforce the law and do what needs to be done to enforce our laws. I don't think there's another prudent way. So from a policy standpoint, I honestly think it's exigent. And I think that this is an unlawful stunt by the state of California, which I understand from a politics standpoint. I just wish our politics wasn't here and we could be adults.
Yeah, I think how a lot of folks, a lot of us on the left at least, see it as the reason why this is happening, the doxing and the vehicular incidents, is that it's a response to what a lot of us feel is a clear authoritarianism that we have no other ways of combating. And so you see things like communities passing out whistles or phone trees, or, saying, who are you? Go home. Or even, some of the, I do not accept or endorse violence against law enforcement officers for really any reason. But I think that's the sense is this is just such a god awful policy. And actually, majority of Americans will say that ICE goes too far, even if they're not for unauthorized people in the country. But the problem is, and I think this is us being, or many Americans being in their bunkers, when you look at the public opinion data on this, small but clear majorities of Americans do not approve of ICE or ICE tactics, but they're small majorities. And the breakdown by party, it's really huge. Something like 80%, 85% of Republicans approve, around 85% of Democrats disapprove. And yeah, there are more independents who disapprove of ICE than approve, but it's kind of like a soft disapproval. And I guess my point being is that that there's not nearly enough of Americans who are outraged or disgusted by this, if you will, to kind of force any change in policy. Because what I'd really like to see, if this really were an issue, what I would love to see is something like mandating body cams for ICE agents. And there actually were a few pilot programs for this in the Biden administration. And to give Trump credit, they've continued, I believe, in some instances through Trump 2.0. It kind of surprised me to find out. And it wouldn't be all that expensive. I crunched the numbers. We're talking probably around $90 million in year one, then an annual recurring cost of somewhere between $60 to $65 million. And, that's couch cushion money for the federal government. And I would say wrap that up in a bill that says, hey, let's raise pay for these agents because it's a hard job. They're facing a lot of resistance. Let's give them the tools they do. Let's protect them, but let's also make sure that they are accountable. And so I think that, I made that argument of policing in general is that cops, law enforcement needs to be paid more, but held to a higher standard. And I know there's been this big push to hire a lot more ICE agents. And my concern, and whenever we see something like this, is that quality tends to go down the drain. You're not getting the best people. And I think especially in law enforcement, when you're giving people this authority to literally take people's freedom away, we need the best people. We need to pay them better. We need to train them better. And we need to hold them to such a high standard. I don't think we're doing enough of any of that. And to me, that's real law enforcement reform. But I don't think anyone's serious about doing that.
Yeah, the majority of Americans don't have anti-immigrant impulses, even if they believe we should have a strong border and a wall even. I think that they're pro-immigrant. It's just pro-immigrant the right way. And I think that local civil liberties and our safety in our homes and distrust of authoritarian, strong government, I think most Americans agree on. And that if the country can change its trajectory of gamesmanship, that everything's about political wins, and we do that so much forever that the country loses, issues like this, we're never going to be able to do what we need to do, which is our charge for actually taking care of the American people. And I think the unfortunate thing about this issue is that the president and his policies are solving an issue, are actually addressing an issue that his political opponents animalistically do not want addressed and solved. And so the smart type, your impulse, Mike, which is extremely reasonable, and is shared by me. I think this is an issue, unfortunately, where we're ships passing in the night in the propaganda wars, like in the capital city of the Hunger Games. And that's unfortunate thing is that's where the real solutions are, or in real politics with real people talking about real solutions. But it actually means our immigration laws are going to be enforced, and we're not doxing and threatening the agents who are doing that, which I think right now, unfortunately, is a necessity. For them to be able to protect their identities and doing what they're doing.
Just a point of clarification: when you say that some Democrats animalistically are against doing this, can you kind of expand it? Because I'm not sure I know what you mean by that.
I think that there are a lot of Democrats that do not want to have closed borders and do not want to enforce our immigration laws to send illegals back out of the country.
Got it. Okay. Yeah.
I don't think they want that. So it's an issue of he wins on that. He does it. And even though he wins, it's no, you don't. You're still not going to do it. It's a power. And that's part of the hubris. It's a power, even though on this exact issue, it's a massive resistance on an issue that the democratic process produced a result that the folks didn't like.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. I know we on the left would not even, I guess, even folks who are more comfortable with tighter border security and at least focusing on people with criminal records who are unauthorized migrants, and I don't mean the crime of just being in the country unauthorized, some other crime. Even then, you can be in favor of kind of tightening those things up and be against sort of the methodology. In fact, that kind of seems to be, at least somewhat of an issue. But yeah. All right.
Well, smart people create the problem and the methodology by creating situations where they're baited into having to do what they have. Bait is the wrong word, but it's the best word I've got on the fly. Yeah. Baited into enforcing it the way they are because there's no other way to enforce it, because there's significant efforts that are made to subvert and avoid the exercise of the federal law enforcement authority that was already on the books, but was pocket vetoed by administrations and now is actually being enforced.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah. I guess fundamentally, and this is where, in some respects, I mean, I'm certainly policy-wise, I'm a center-left kind of guy, but fundamentally, philosophically, I'm a conservative in the old Burkean sense, and certainly Donald Trump is not. And so what I see on this and in so many other things is time and time again, you take these big swings, do these big things without really a lot of background or data. Like, for instance, it's a really important question, I think, in this discussion of this issue to say, well, okay, exactly how widespread is the doxing and these threats to these agents, and how widespread on the other end are the issue of people being detained, kidnapped, whether it's by agents or people pretending to be agents. We don't really have good data. It's like anecdotes either way. And I just get fundamentally uncomfortable governing based on anecdotes. And it seems like we do, well, this is a good story. And to me, more and more, the question a lot of our so-called policymakers are asking isn't what's the best policy, is how well can we fundraise off of this? And when that becomes the question, we're in big trouble.
One of the vices of what I'll non-charitably frame as deliberate, bureaucratic, data-driven paralysis is that stuff doesn't actually get done.
Sure, yeah. I mean, yeah.
And this is a problem. This is a problem that this is an issue that absolutely needed to be addressed.
No, I get that. There's always going to be that tension. It says if you wait for all the data to come in, you never act. But if you just act just kind of off of vibes or whims, well, then so there always is. And I clearly think that Donald Trump is over-indexing on the just kind of, ready, fire, aim kind of thing. But anyway, so, we have already gone a little bit longer than we normally do, but that's okay. There is so much that we didn't get to, and we will move that into our midweek show. Like, I'm interested in talking about the Comey prosecution and some issues with that, the future of ACA subsidies. We got some rants, some recommendations. Maybe we'll take some questions. All of that will happen on the midweek show. And if you are, of course, a supporter, you will get that full thing. If you're not, you'll get a little bit of a preview, and hopefully you'll say, wow, that was pretty good. I want to hear more. I'd like to be a supporter, so we'll be doing that on Tuesday. But if you want to get that full midweek episode and you're not a supporter, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com. I'm happy to get that set up for you free as charge. We never want to let inability to support us financially get in the way of you hearing what we have to say. And you can do that on Patreon, PayPal. You can just send, gold ingots through the mail if you want to do that. Maybe don't do that, actually. But all of that's, of course, always in the show notes, all of our support links. And if and whether you're supporter or not a supporter, it really does help us out a lot. Just takes a second if you just subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you're listening on, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And as always, a very special thanks goes out to our wonderful executive producing team. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,